A Friday evening at Villa Sereno turned out to be noisy and lively. This restaurant, steeped in Italian luxury, was a favorite spot for the wealthy residents of Savannah, Georgia. Every corner of the room exuded elegance. The walls adorned with frescoes, reminiscent of Tuscan villas, and the soft light of chandeliers gently touched the tables, where those accustomed to the best gathered. Music, barely perceptible, flowed from the piano in the corner of the hall, creating the perfect backdrop for conversations. For the guests of Villa Sereno, this evening promised to be just another exquisite dinner, but for waitress Eliza Morton, everything was different. A 26-year-old girl with big dreams and small means, she balanced between tables like a dancer, pondering not only what to serve, but also what to conceal. Her face, framed by dark curls, was calm, almost serene, but inside a storm of emotions raged. Her true place was not here, not with a tray in her hands, but at the piano in the corner. However, the piano was not hers, and life was even less subject to her dreams. Eliza always felt special when her fingers touched the keys. Music was her first love, her way of expressing what words could not convey. In childhood, her mother's old piano became not just an instrument, but a true friend, opening up a world full of possibilities. But life rarely leaves room for dreams if they don't bring in money. Working at Villa Sereno helped pay the bills, but it didn't bring peace to her heart. On this evening, she had barely caught her breath between orders when she heard the door slam. Astor Hayward entered the restaurant. His appearance caused an almost imperceptible pause, as if the very energy in the room trembled. Tall, slender, with impeccably styled ash-gray hair, he exuded an aura of superiority. His entourage, a group of carefully selected companions, each striving not to lag behind his brilliance, followed him like secondary actors in a drama where Astor was the only star. In a perfectly fitting suit, with a cold gaze, he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to absolute power. His reputation preceded him, a magnate known for his millions, biting wit, and ability to make those around him feel insignificant. The restaurant staff instantly tensed, sensing the energy he brought with him. Astor Hayward was not someone who could be ignored. For the staff, his name was synonymous with tense work and potential problems. Astor was famous not only for his wealth, but also for his tendency to cause scenes. Eliza, seeing him at one of her tables, mentally sighed, but her face remained serene. She approached him with a tray, ready to meet another difficult client. When she approached, Astor looked up at her. His eyes, cold as polished steel, slid over her face and then stopped at the name tag with her name. "Eliza," he drawled, as if tasting this name. "Sounds intriguing. Tell me, how long have you been working here?" She met his gaze, maintaining a professional smile. "For several years already," she replied calmly. "I assume you have other talents besides serving plates?" His voice sounded casual, but there was a hidden subtext in it. Her smile became a bit strained, but she did not falter. "Each of us is talented in our own way, Mr. Hayward. What will you order?" He smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in that smile, only interest. "First tell me," he began as if forgetting her question, "do you like working here?" The question was unexpected, almost rhetorical, but there was a subtext in it that she could not ignore. "Work is work, Mr. Hayward," she replied calmly. "Logical," he responded, leaning back in his chair. "But you don't look like someone who is content with little." His words made her tense, but she maintained a polite smile. "First, bring me the best scotch this place has. Then we'll see." She nodded and left, feeling his gaze as if he were pulling invisible strings behind her. Returning to the kitchen, she forced herself to steady her breath. This man was just another customer, she reminded herself. But for some reason, his presence seemed more ominous than the clattering of dishes or the mockery of other clients. Eliza felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the Villa Sereno hall pressing on her shoulders as she slowly walked toward the piano. Her steps were steady, but inside everything burned with tension. Light conversations at the tables ceased. The guests stopped pretending not to notice what was happening. She felt the attention of the hall pinning her in place, like a spotlight on an actor on stage. The piano stood in the corner of the hall, gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers. Its shiny surface reflected her silhouette, and this mirror seemed to complement her inner conflict. She stopped in front of the instrument and ran her hand over the lid of the keys, as if checking if it was real. Her fingers trembled, but she took a deep breath to calm herself. "Well, Eliza?" Astor's voice sounded from behind her, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You won't disappoint us, will you?" His words elicited a slight laugh from his companions. Eliza pursed her lips, lowering her gaze to the keys. Memories flashed through her mind, how she played for hours on her mother's old piano as a child, how music was her way to escape reality, to become something more than herself. But this moment was different. This was not her decision. She felt forced, cornered. Her talent, her love for music, all of it was turning into a spectacle for the amusement of a rich man in his audience. She looked back at the hall. Some guests watched with obvious interest, others with bewilderment, and some even with slight disapproval, expecting her to refuse. But there were also those whose gazes expressed silent support, as if they wished her luck. Her colleagues watched her from a distance with concern, but no one dared to intervene. "If you want, I can help you choose a piece," Astor added sarcastically. Eliza looked up at him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Hayward, but I can manage on my own." She turned back to the piano and sat on the bench, straightening her back. Her breathing slowed, and her fingers gently rested on the keys. The cold surface of the instrument touched her skin, as if inviting her to forget everything. For a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to be immersed in the sensation. Her fingers began to move, and the first note sounded, soft, almost uncertain, but clear. She chose Debussy's Clair de Lune. This piece was familiar to her in every detail, every nuance. The music began to fill the hall slowly, like a tide. Her hands moved more confidently, her fingers easily finding their way across the keys, drawing out a melody that seemed to float in the air. At first, the hall listened in silence, as if doubting whether to pay attention to the waitress's playing. But as the music unfolded, as its notes filled the space, the atmosphere began to change. Conversations ceased altogether. People turned to see where the sound was coming from. Even Astor, sitting with a smirk at his table, frowned, as if he hadn't expected to hear something so deep and touching. Eliza let the music speak for her. She stopped noticing the hall, Astor, everything around her. Each note was a confession, each expressing her fears, hopes, and sacrifices. She played for herself, but in doing so, she enchanted those around her. When the last note faded, there was absolute silence. Eliza did not open her eyes, her fingers still resting on the keys, as if unwilling to let go of the moment. She was afraid to look at the hall, afraid to see their reaction. And then the silence was broken by applause. It started with one or two people, but soon the hall was filled with the thunder of ovations. People clapped, some even stood up. Eliza slowly looked up and saw the guests applauding, their faces expressing genuine admiration. Even Astor could not resist applauding, although his face showed a mix of surprise and annoyance. His smirk disappeared, replaced by an expression of thoughtfulness, as if he was reevaluating his initial opinion of her. Eliza stood up and made a small bow, trying not to meet Astor's gaze. This moment was not for him, not for their strange game. It was her own small return to who she had always been, an artist. She slowly returned to her station, feeling her knees tremble, but her posture remained straight. Her colleagues smiled at her. Some whispered words of support. Eliza could not suppress a faint smile as her fingers still held the sensation of the keys. She did not know what awaited her next, but at that moment, she felt that this was the beginning of something bigger. Eliza returned to her station, still feeling the echo of applause in her ears. It seemed as if her body moved automatically. She poured water for one table, brought desserts to another. But inside, everything was different. Her heart still beat in her chest with deafening force, as if trying to break out. The last notes of Clair de Lune, which she had played, echoed in her head, as if leaving a trace that could not be erased. Astor Hayward sat at his table in the center of the hall. His gaze followed Eliza, but now there was no mockery in it. He seemed thoughtful, even a bit embarrassed, as if confused by what he had just heard. His companions whispered to each other, nodding in Eliza's direction, but he paid them no attention. His face was a mask of tense contemplation. Eliza, feeling his gaze, did everything possible to avoid meeting his eyes. She did not want more conversations, no explanations. She had already said everything she could through her music, but she knew that the evening would not end there. Astor was a man who did not allow things to end on his terms. When the hall came back to life and the guests returned to their conversations, Astor stood up. He walked towards her station, his steps slow but confident, like a man accustomed to getting his way. Eliza noticed him before he could speak and tried to maintain an outward calm. "You surprised me," he began, stopping a few steps away from her. His voice sounded softer than before, but there was still something predatory in it. "I expected, well, something different." Eliza met his gaze, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "You expected that I couldn't do it?" He smirked, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Possibly, but I admit I was wrong. You play as if a whole world is contained within you. Why do you hide this?" Her heart tightened at his words. She knew this could be a trap, but there was genuine interest in his voice. "Because sometimes dreams are what you keep to yourself," she replied, avoiding too much sincerity. Astor leaned in a bit closer, but still maintained his distance. "I disagree. A talent like yours is not meant to be hidden behind tables. If you were on stage, people would pay to hear you." Eliza tensed but did not allow herself to show it. "My place is here, Mr. Hayward. I don't think this evening should turn into an analysis of my ambitions." He laughed, but it was a quiet laugh, more like thoughtful surprise. "Fine. Let's leave your ambitions aside. But tell me, Eliza, why did you agree to play after all? You could have walked away, refused." Her gaze lingered on him longer than she intended. "Because sometimes it's easier to yield than to argue," she said evenly, "especially when you know the whole hall is watching you." Astor raised an eyebrow, as if her answer surprised him more than he expected. "You chose to put yourself on trial before the public rather than simply walk away? Interesting choice." Eliza did not respond, simply shifting her gaze to the tray in her hands, as if she needed to return to work. But Astor was in no hurry to leave. "You know," he continued, no longer hiding the thoughtfulness in his voice, "I've seen many people trying to prove something to the world. Most of them just shout loudly, but there's nothing behind it. But you have something real." She froze for a second, hearing these words. They were unexpected, and her inner defense wavered slightly, but she quickly regained control. "Thank you, Mr. Hayward, but I'm afraid I need to get back to work. If you need anything, just let me know." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Eliza." She looked back over her shoulder. "You deserve more than this place. Think about it." This time his words did not sound like a provocation. They were serious, almost sincere. Eliza did not know what to reply, so she simply nodded and walked away, leaving him standing in the shadows. All evening she felt his gaze on her, but he did not try to talk to her again. When she finished her shift and change, her colleagues exchanged short, approving phrases. None of them dared to say more, but their gazes expressed pride. On her way home, Eliza remembered not only the applause and the music, but also Astor's words. "You deserve more." They clung to her consciousness like a reminder that her talent still mattered, even if she tried to convince herself otherwise. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to ask the question, what if he's right? The night in Savannah was warm, but the air seemed charged with tension. Eliza walked home, trying not to look back, but her thoughts revolved around one thing: applause, the gleam of chandeliers, and Astor's words. They echoed in her head like the aftermath of her own music, reverberating in the silence. "You deserve more." These words stuck with her like a thorn. She knew Astor was a provocateur, a man who always sought the weaknesses of others. But there was no usual bravado in his voice at that moment. She could not shake the feeling that he was sincere. This made it even harder. Harder to reject not only him, but also that part of herself that still believed she was capable of more. When she entered her tiny apartment, the light in the room was dim. On the shelf stood her old piano, worn and long, out of tune. It looked at her like a reminder of the past she tried to forget. Eliza sat down on the bench and carefully touched the keys. The notes sounded muffled, but they still held the same potential she once loved. She closed her eyes and slowly played the same melody she had played at Villa Sereno. But this time, no one was listening except her. "This place is not for you." Astor's voice resurfaced in her consciousness. She recoiled from the keys as if touched by an electric shock. "What does he even know?" she muttered aloud. But she did not believe herself. He was right. She knew it. But admitting it meant confronting the dreams she had tried to bury for so long. The next day, the restaurant lived its usual life, but the atmosphere had changed. The guests seemed to look at her differently. Some smiled, others whispered quietly as she passed by. One of the regulars, an elderly woman in a pearl necklace, took her hand when Eliza served her a glass of wine. "Dear, you play as if life itself speaks through you," she said with a warm smile. "Never give this up." Eliza thanked her, but inside everything tightened. The old lady's words were kind, but they only added pressure. Astor appeared that evening closer to 8, as usual with a group of companions. He entered with his usual confidence, but his gaze immediately found Eliza. He nodded slightly as if saying, "We're not finished." She averted her eyes, but her heart suddenly beat faster. When she approached his table, he was waiting for her with his characteristic half-smile. "Good evening, Eliza," she replied calmly, but her voice was a bit cooler than before. "Good evening, Mr. Hayward. What will you order?" "Tonight? I'll order the same thing," he replied, leaning his elbow on the edge of the table. "But I'm not interested in the food." Her eyes flashed, but she suppressed her irritation. "In that case, perhaps I should call our sommelier to your table?" His smile widened, almost mockingly. "You're hiding behind words again, Eliza." She gripped the tray a bit tighter than necessary. "I thought last night gave you enough food for thought, Mr. Hayward." "On the contrary," he objected, his tone becoming more serious. "Last night made me wonder why someone with a talent like yours continues to hide behind these trays." Her face twitched slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Everyone makes choices based on their circumstances," she replied. "Or out of fear," he added. Her gaze turned icy. "You know nothing about my circumstances." "True," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I see how you play, and that's all I need to know." She stood before him for another second, then abruptly nodded and walked away, not waiting for his response. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, the manager called her aside. "Eliza," he began cautiously, "you know everyone is talking about last night?" She froze, expecting the worst. "One of the guests told me we have a real diamond working here." She wanted to say something, but the manager continued. "Maybe you should think about it. You could be more than just a part of this place." These words sounded to her like an echo of what Astor had said. She nodded but said nothing, and the same question that she had asked herself the previous night echoed in her head. What if they're right? But Eliza knew, to find the answer, she would have to not only believe in her talent again, but also overcome her greatest fear, the fear of herself. Eliza was preparing to end her shift when she suddenly noticed a figure approaching her station. It was Astor Hayward. This time, his companions remained at the table, and he looked much less pompous than usual. There was focus in his eyes, and it made her slightly tense. "Are you leaving?" he began, his voice calm, but there was tension in it. "The shift is almost over," she replied briefly, trying to maintain neutrality. "Then let's talk," he said and pointed to an empty table in the corner. Eliza hesitated. She had the urge to reject his offer, but her inner sense told her that there was something more to this conversation than just a continuation of their argument from the previous night. She reluctantly nodded and sat down across from him, folding her hands on her knees. "Listen," he began, leaning forward. "I know you don't think people like me can understand people like you. You think I'm just a rich show-off playing my games. And honestly, sometimes you're right." Her eyebrows raised slightly, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "But that doesn't mean I can't see talent when it's in front of me. You don't just play well, Eliza. You play in a way that makes people stop in their tracks. You touch their souls. And that's a gift that shouldn't be wasted behind these tables. It's just a performance, Mr. Hayward, she replied, trying to sound indifferent. And it won't change my life. Maybe it will, he countered, and there was a note of determination in his voice. I have a friend, Daniel Crane. You might have heard of him. He runs one of the best music troupes in New York. They're looking for a new pianist for their next tour. Eliza froze. Her mind instantly began to process his words feverishly. New York? A music troupe? It sounded like something incredible, like a dream too far from her reality. And what are you saying? She finally asked, her voice trembling. I'm saying I can arrange a meeting for you with Daniel. I know him well enough to make him listen to you. But you have to be ready for this, Eliza. This is not a joke. It's a real opportunity. She was silent for a long time, looking down at her hands. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed the whole hall could hear it. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly, finally looking up. Because I see that you have potential that can't be ignored. And maybe I want to prove that you're wrong about me, he added with a slight smile. Eliza did not know what to say. She could not believe that such an opportunity had come to her out of nowhere. She could not believe that a man who had been unpleasant to her just 2 days ago was now offering her a chance she had dreamed of all her life. I need to think about it, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Of course, Astor replied, standing up. But don't think too long. Such chances don't wait forever. He left a business card on the table and returned to his table. Eliza looked at it as if it were the key to a door she was afraid to open. That night, Eliza could not sleep. She kept replaying the conversation with Astor in her head. Doubts and fears battled with her dreams. But by morning, when the first rays of the sun touched her window, she realized such a chance comes only once in a lifetime. She took the business card, dialed the number, and within a few days, her life had changed. She sat at the piano in Daniel Crane's studio, her fingers coming alive again, playing with such passion that words were unnecessary. When she finished, Daniel looked at her with a smile. Welcome to the troupe, Eliza. And at that moment, her life truly turned around. She was no longer just a waitress. Now she was a musician. Her story was just beginning. The morning when Eliza heard Daniel Crane's words seemed to arrive in another life. Those few words, welcome to the troupe, turned her world upside down, as if fate finally extended its hand to her. They sounded not just like a job offer, but like a confirmation of her value, a sign that her dreams had been alive all this time, despite all her doubts. Daniel's studio, filled with light, with the piano standing in the center, seemed to have been waiting just for her. In this place, Eliza felt that her past, endless shifts at the restaurant, fatigue and doubts, was finally behind her. She was no longer that waitress who only dreamed of music. Now she had become part of something bigger. Her first days in the troupe were filled with mixed feelings, exhilaration from rehearsals and, at the same time, fear that she might not cope. Eliza was learning not only new performance techniques, but also how to live in a world where music was not a hobby, but the meaning of existence. Her colleagues in the troupe accepted her with warm caution, like someone who still had to prove their place. And she proved herself, every day, every rehearsal. Her hands, once again mastering the freedom of the piano, became more and more confident, each note finding its depth. She was not just playing, she was living music. The first performance was in a hall in Manhattan. The hall was filled with the sounds of the preparing audience, the rustling of programs, hushed conversations, and the shuffling of chairs. When Eliza stepped onto the stage, her heart was pounding wildly. She looked at the piano standing in the center of the stage, and for a moment was overwhelmed by memories of that evening at Villa Sereno. The same fear, the same doubts. But then, as if an inner voice reminded her, "You've already been through this," and she began to play. The music filled the hall, and everything else disappeared. Eliza no longer saw the faces in the hall, heard nothing but the sound of the keys under her fingers. She played as if her whole life was reduced to this moment. When the last note faded, the hall erupted in applause so loud that tears welled up in her eyes. That night, sitting in her new apartment in New York, Eliza reflected on how her life had changed in such a short time. She looked at her hands, the same hands that for years had carried plates, and now created music that touched other people's hearts. She realized that her success was not just the result of talent, but also of her decision to take a step towards her dreams. How many times could she have refused, hidden behind fear, run away from the challenge? And yet, that night in the restaurant, under Astor Hayward's watchful gaze and the expectation of the entire hall, she chose not to avoid but to take a risk. This decision changed everything. Eliza realized that sometimes fate throws us chances, but it's up to us to take them. Faith in oneself does not come on its own. It is born from the decisions we make despite doubts. She thought of the millions of people who hide their talents, put off dreams, afraid of being judged or not accepted. And what if each of them just tried? It doesn't matter where you are now, on stage or in a restaurant. What matters is only one thing. What are you willing to do to make your dreams a reality? Her meeting with Astor was a coincidence, but this coincidence turned out to be a turning point. It made her confront herself, her fears, and hidden desires. This coincidence proved that sometimes changes come unexpectedly, when you least expect them. But coincidences don't work on their own. It was the choice she made, the choice to stand up and play, that gave the coincidence a chance to become destiny. Today, Eliza looked at her reflection in the dressing room mirror. Ahead of her was another concert, another hall full of people. But now she felt not fear, but confidence. She knew her place was right here. She smiled at her reflection and whispered, "This is just the beginning." Her path to the stage began that evening at Villa Sereno. But the real story was just unfolding. She knew there would be new challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid of them. In her hands were not just the keys, but also her future. And you? What's holding you back from taking a step towards your dreams? Maybe today is your chance to believe in yourself. If Eliza's story inspired you, if her journey to her dream touched your heart, don't forget to support us. Subscribe, like, and share this story with your friends. Maybe it will be the inspiration someone needs to believe in themselves. Your likes and subscriptions are the opportunity to tell even more stories about the power of spirit, courage, and unexpected chances. Together we will remind the world, dreams are worth fighting for.